One afternoon in 1953, the city of Chicago was preparing for a visit of the 1952 recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. Reporters, officials, dignitaries, and the welcoming committee had gathered at the railway station waiting for his arrival. The air was filled with anticipation and excitement, and when the train came to a halt and he stepped off the train, you couldn't miss him. He was a giant of a man, 6'4" tall, erect in posture, with bushy hair and a large mustache, dressed in a simple white khaki suit and tie. The only thing missing was his trademark tropical helmet. Cameras flashed and the city officials approached him with outstretched hand and presented him with a key to the city. They began telling him how honored they were to meet him, and they welcomed him to the Windy City. He expressed a polite thanks, then paused for a moment as he looked over the heads of the crowd. Something had caught his attention. He looked at the dignitaries and asked if he could be excused for a moment. He then made his way through the crowd on the platform with quick, firm steps until he reached an elderly black lady who had also got off the train and was struggling with 2 large suitcases. No one had offered to help her. Everyone's attention was on the man in the white suit who had just got off the train himself and was making his way to this lady. He nodded to the lady, picked up her 2 suitcases in his big hands, and carried them to the luggage department of the bus, waiting to take her to her destination. The bus driver took the suitcases from him, placed them on the rack, and the man helped the lady on the bus, helped her to find a seat, wished her a safe journey, and said he hoped there would be someone else on the other side to help her with her luggage. Meanwhile, the crowd had tagged along behind him, observing the scene. Then he made his way back to the welcome committee and said, "Sorry I kept you waiting." The welcoming committee continued their planned speeches almost in a hushed tone. It was as if the guest had just given a speech that had overshadowed anything that they had wanted to say. The Nobel Peace Prize winner was the famous missionary Dr. Albert Schweitzer, who had spent his life helping the poorest of the poor in Africa. One of the members of the official welcoming committee, standing on the platform, turned to one of the reporters of the Chicago Times and said, "This is the first time I've ever seen a sermon walking." Have you ever seen a sermon walking? I have. I've seen sermons walking since the outbreak of the coronavirus. I've seen it when people reached out to their neighbors to see if they were all right. I've seen it when young people got groceries for the elderly. I've seen it when frontline workers put their health at risk to help others. At a church in Toronto where I was the minister, we had a member of the congregation who spent several days each week at the church. He was a retired engineer who cleaned the church, fixed everything that needed fixing, and worked on new improvements for the church. He had done this for over 30 years, and he had never asked for a penny for it. And when I asked him why he did this, he said, "Well, I can't preach like you. I can't sing in the choir, but I could use my hands. And this is my way of serving God." He gave a sermon by his actions. He was a sermon walking. And I'm starting to believe that sermons walking are often more powerful than sermons by words alone. On the evening of the day of Jesus' resurrection, 2 people were walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus, where they lived. One was called Cleopas. The name of the other person isn't mentioned. Sharon Ringe, the professor at Wellesley Seminary in Washington, thinks that the other one may have been his wife. That would explain that they were both heading for the same house. They were on their way to Emmaus, and Luke tells us that it was at about 11 kilometers from Jerusalem, a good 2-hour walk. They were disciples of Jesus. They had been followers of Jesus. And in Jerusalem, they had experienced firsthand what had happened in the past days. They'd been there when Jesus was crucified. They had seen Jesus being put in the grave, and that was 3 days ago, and so much has happened since. And they were trying to figure it all out. It was as if all the wonderful changes that had come in their lives since they had met Jesus had all come crashing down. Ever since they had met Jesus, their lives had changed. Jesus had made them look at the world differently. He'd made them look at themselves differently. Instead of always feeling judged and criticized, they now felt loved and appreciated. Instead of feeling alone, they feel that they now belonged. They had been so happy as followers of Jesus, but now it was all over. In Jerusalem, they had killed Jesus, and with that, all their hopes were gone. With tears in their eyes, they had left the city and started their 2-hour walk back to Emmaus. On their way, they were recalling the events of the past day. What were they to make of the story of the women who had said that Jesus was alive and that they had seen him? They claimed that the grave was empty and that they had seen an angel by the grave who had asked them, "Why are you looking for the living among the dead?" But if Jesus was alive, how come they hadn't seen him? There were conflicting stories in what had happened. Were there 2 women, or were there 3 or many? Was there 1 angel, or were there 2? It was all so confusing. Therefore, they may as well go home. And they're on their way with tears in their eyes. And as they were on their way, a stranger had come up beside them and started to walk with them. Now, that didn't surprise them. It was smart for him to join them. They knew that it could be dangerous to walk by yourself, and people were encouraged to walk in groups. It's the opposite of what we are experiencing today. And the stranger asked them, "What were you talking about?" They stopped. "Excuse me? What were we talking about? Where have you been? Don't you know what has happened in Jerusalem? You must be the only one. Have you not heard about the crucifixion of Jesus?" It was as if today someone would have said, "You haven't heard of the coronavirus? Where have you been? Well, let us fill you in." And they tell him about Jesus. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all his people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, today is the 3rd day after all this happened. Some of the women amazed us. They went to the grave early in the morning, but they didn't find the body. They told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. And some of our companions went to the tomb and found it, just as the women had said. But they didn't see Jesus. So where is he? Now, it's a stranger's turn to talk. Who is this stranger? Well, Luke gives us a spoiler alert. He tells us that it was Jesus who had come to walk beside them. But they didn't know that. They didn't recognize him. Why? Why didn't they recognize him? They'd been with him and they'd been followers of him. Had everything that filled their minds stopped them from seeing what was right beside them? Were they so focused on themselves that they couldn't focus on someone right beside them? Luke simply said that they were kept from recognizing him. And now the stranger starts to talk. He said, "How foolish are you, and how slow of heart to believe that all the prophets, what they have spoken. Didn't Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. And as they walked to Emmaus, he walked through the scriptures, and gradually it started to make sense. Gradually, the light came on. They started to see that the death and resurrection of Jesus is part of a much larger story. It's part of a story that started at the creation of the universe. Did you see that all this had to happen? when God said that saw that all he had made was good, an evil God took hold of us, and we got ourselves into trouble, God had come to rescue us. Don't you see that all through the scriptures this was predicted? Don't you see that Christ had come to die so that death would not have the last word? Can you imagine what it would be like to listen to Jesus giving a sermon as they walked down the road? Would you not have loved to listen to the sermon walking? How would it have felt? And Luke tells us that their hearts were burning inside them. Well, they had lost all sense of time listening to the stranger, and before they knew it, they had reached their home. It looked as if the stranger had further to go. But they said, "Why don't you come in and stay with us? Look, it's almost dark, and then you can be on your way in the morning." I'm sure they would have loved to hear some more from this stranger. So he went in to stay with them. A meal is prepared. Hospitality is a sacred obligation. And as they gathered around the table, the stranger takes the bread, he broke it, and he gave it to them. Wait, wasn't that the job of the host? It seems that the stranger has now becoming the host. And then as he began to give it to them, their eyes were opened and they recognized him. It was Jesus. How did they recognize him? Was it that they remembered the Passover meal that he had with his disciples when he took bread, broke it, and said, "This is my body that is for you"? Was it his wounds in his hands? Was it the sermon on the meaning of the scripture that all of a sudden had made sense? I don't know. They have no time to think about it. They look up, but then Jesus is gone. They look at each other. They were so excited. There was no way that they could go to sleep now. They get their coats back on and they're out of the door, back to Jerusalem. Another 2-hour walk, and now in the dark. They just have to tell the disciples they had met Jesus. He'd been right beside them. But when they had recognized him, he was gone. He was no longer right beside them, but now he had become part of them. He had become to live right inside them. Their hearts were bursting with joy. They could feel the power of love inside them, the love that Jesus had brought in their lives, the love that Jesus had brought in the world. Albert Einstein, as you know, is the world-famous scientist, and he was the 1921 winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in physics. He also was a prolific letter writer. Most of the letters were directed to his daughter. His letters are now made public, and here is what he wrote to his daughter, Liesel, in the 1930s, and I quote, "There is an extremely powerful force that so far science has not found a formal explanation to. It's a force that includes and governs all others and even is behind any phenomenon operating in the universe and has not yet been identified by us. This universal force is love. When scientists looked for a unified theory of the universe, they forgot the most powerful unseen force. Love is light that enlightens those who give and receive it. Love is gravity because it makes some people feel attracted to others. Love is power because it multiplies the best we have and allows humanity not to be extinguished in their blind selfishness. Love unfolds and reveals. For love we live. Love is God, and God is love. If we want our species to survive, if we want to find meaning in our lives, if we want to save the world and every sentient being that inhabits it, love is the only and one answer." End of quote. John said, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, not to condemn the world, but to save it." Praise be to God. Amen.